Yeah, first of all, good morning. I am Anjuli Chandra. I am an electrical engineer as well as an MBA, and I joined Central Electricity Authority, if you have heard of that, under Ministry of Power in after doing my engineering through Indian Engineering Service. And I've worked in Central Electricity Authority, Punjab State Electricity Board, Delhi Electricity Regulatory Commission, and I'm now member Punjab State Electricity Regulatory Commission. Okay, I think we have gone through the round. So I think three of you are already working and you must be knowing a lot about distribution. But today I have been asked first to do the Salient Features of Electricity Act 2003. So I will start with that, and you please feel free to ask questions anytime, even in between, because once you finish, then you can't go back to that. So please ask questions, and I'll stop whenever you want me to. So
Okay,
as you
madam.
all know, the first act in India was which governed electricity was the Indian Electricity Act 1910, and it provided the basic framework for electricity supply industry in India. The growth of the sector was mainly through private licensees, and the license was granted by the state governments. There was provision for license for supply of electricity in a specified area. The power plants then were very small and you were supplying only in a limited area. And it laid down the legal framework for laying down of wires and other works in that particular area. You were granted a license for a particular area for generating and supplying in that particular area, and it laid down the relationship between the licensee and the consumer. Then, after independence, this continued till independence, and after independence, electricity was defined as a concurrent subject. So, what do we mean by a concurrent subject is that both central and state can make laws. However, in case of conflict, central law prevails. So, the 1948 Act defined electricity as a concurrent subject, and both could make laws, the center as well as the state. And the Electricity Supply Act was promulgated in 1948. It mandated the creation of state electricity boards. As I told you that in 1910 there were limited generation facilities which were supplying to uh, pockets around them. However, when we got independent, then the government felt that electricity is the basic infrastructure for the development of the country, for the development of the people. So it mandated creation of state electricity boards. The need was felt for the state to step in through the SCBs to extend electrification to all parts of the country. When you had private developers, they were very small and they were in small areas. So the state thought that it would put in its money to spend to extend electricity to every nook and corner of the state. And the government was the owner as well as the regulator. And this act dealt with the statutory powers and functions of CEA, state electricity boards, and generating companies. The state electricity boards were generators also. There were private generators also. They continued to operate, which all the private generators which existed before the promulgation of this act, they continued to operate. Therefore, it dealt with the powers and functions of the CEA, state electricity boards, and generating companies. And these state electricity boards were not viable entities. Basically, they were socio-economic entities they were spending money to extend electrification. However, they were not getting any return on whatever they were spending. The spending was more than the revenue. So amendment was brought in 1985 that the earning of a minimum return of 3% on fixed assets is a statutory requirement. So this did come in, and but still the state electricity boards were not able to provide to get this 3% return on fixed assets. They were running into losses. Then came the Electricity Amendment Act in 1991. This liberalized the power sector. You know what happened when the electricity started to go to all parts of the country? There was not enough generation to support the demand. The states could not, via their state electricity boards, could not put in enough generation facilities to meet the demand. They did not have the money to establish generating stations. Therefore, the Electricity Amendment Act in 1991 came, where private entities could establish, operate, and maintain power generation plants as independent power producers. Earlier, everything was in the hands of the state electricity boards, and there were local generators, but there was nothing more. So when the demand for electricity was felt, then private entities were allowed to establish and operate power generation plants. And they were called the independent power producers, IPPs. The IPPs could enter into agreements with the state electricity board, and there were incentives to the IPPs that they could be with 100% foreign ownership also. They could be Indian, they could be 100% foreign ownership, they could be anywhere of a mix also. And debt equity ratios up to 4:1 were permissible. What do I mean by debt equity ratio? That when you put up any power plant, the ratio is generally 70-30. But in this case, it could be 80-20 also. That 80% of loans and 20% of your own money. Then, it was felt that the state electricity boards were a tool of the state governments, and they used to charge tariff from the consumers which the state desired. And as we all see today, even lots of people are promising free electricity, subsidized electricity. Every government is saying we will give first 200 units free, 300 units free, but nothing comes free. So somebody had to pay for it, and the state was paying for it, and the state could not afford these losses. Therefore, the government thought of establishing regulatory commissions. Regulatory commissions basically meant that the regulator would not be the state, but it would be an independent regulator at both the center and state level. There was a thought that there should be separation of ownership from regulation, so that the regulator can decide the tariffs which are economically viable. So in 1998, the act was brought, and under this it was mandated that there would be a regulator at the center, and the states were also asked to establish state electricity regulatory commissions. So this act called for provision for setting up of central and state electricity regulatory commissions with power to determine tariffs, and these tariffs would be independent of the state government. Though practically it did not happen, but it was felt that these regulators would have powers to determine tariffs. The constitution of the State Electricity Regulatory Commission was optional for the states. And the idea, exactly as I told you, was to distance the government from tariff determination. Then, parallelly, as I said, electricity was a concurrent subject, and to reform their electricity systems, the states started bringing their own reform acts. Like Odisha brought an act in 1995, Haryana in 1997, Andhra Pradesh, since both of you are from Andhra Pradesh, it brought its own Reform Act in 1998. UP brought it in 1999. Karnataka again in 1999. Rajasthan in 1999. And Delhi in 2000, and Madhya Pradesh in 2000, and Gujarat in early 2003. So it was felt by the central government that reform legislation is being mandated by the states, by each state, and everybody is reinventing the wheel. So we should have a central act which would, central reform act which would obviate the need for individual states to enact their own reform laws. And there were many new concepts which were coming in electricity. The traditional ones existed. However, people felt the need for power trading, open access, appellate tribunal, etc. As I said, that in 1991, the private entities were allowed to come in. Similarly, before that, the central entities were created in the country to supply power to more than one state. And power grid was established to take the power from the central generating stations to the states. Earlier, generation, transmission, and distribution was with the state. Then in 1975, because the generation was lagging behind the demand, central generating stations with the money from central government were set up so that these could supply power to more than one state. As it is, the resources were not located in the state. For example, what do I mean by that? That coal is mostly available in, say, Odisha, Bihar, Jharkhand, whereas, like a state like Punjab or Haryana, where there are no coal reserves, the state could not set up coal-based plants. It had to get coal from a long distance. It did set up coal-based plants, but naturally, since coal had to travel over a long distance, the plants were more expensive. So it was felt that we should have interstate transmission lines, and PGCIL was set up to transfer the electricity from the central generating stations to the various states. So, as I said, that a lot of states were having their own reform laws. So, to obviate that need, a central act was sought to be made. And this act was first made into a draft by a person called Gajendra Haldia, who was in NCAER. And this, after initial several drafts, a draft Electricity Act was tabled by the Ministry of Power in the Parliament. The act went to the Standing Committee, which recommended some changes as discussed in the Standing Committee on Energy. And after these changes were made, the act was passed by the Parliament in April 03, and it came into force on June 10, 2003. And after that, lots of amendments have come in to certain provisions. Like there was an amendment in January 27, 2004, June 15, 2007, and more have come in. So any question up till now? Anyone?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So basically, Electricity Act tried to harmonize and rationalize the existing laws. There was 1910 Act, there was ES Act 1948, there was the Electricity Regulatory Commission Act 1998. So all these were combined and rationalized and harmonized into one act, which was called the Electricity Act 2003. And it was thought that discipline should be brought to this sector. As I told you, that the sector was running into losses. The state electricity boards could not get money from the consumers. The generators were not being paid because the state electricity boards had to pay the power generators. They were not getting money from their consumers in accordance with what they should have charged. So the government used to tell them to charge less. So all the sector was in a mess. Therefore, Electricity Act 2003 sought to bring discipline in this sector. So the emphasis in this act was on competition in a generation as well as in distribution, and it also brought in the concept of power exchanges and power traders. Earlier, generator was selling directly to the state electricity board, but now a concept of trading was brought in, that it was difficult for the generators located in the entire country and the state electricity boards to find buyers. The concept of traders who connected between generators and the distribution companies was brought in, and it also sought to facilitate privatization, to have multiple licensees, to have franchises. It also sought to strengthen regulation and create a mix of public and private power utilities regulated by the independent regulator. So before this act came into position, as a part of the reforms, the state electricity board was sought to be unbundled into generation utility, transmission utility, and the distribution utility.